Our next speaker is Jonathan Kahn. He is a professor at Hamline University School of Law in Minnesota. Jonathan received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD in history from Cornell University. His groundbreaking research on Bidil, often called the first racial drug, was recently published in his book Race in a Bottle, published by Columbia University Press. He's published his research in a wide array of journals, ranging from Yale Journal of Health Policy, Law and Ethics and Stanford Law and Policy Journal to Health Affairs, American Journal of Bioethics, American Journal of Public Health, Science, and Nature Genetics. Jonathan Kahn.
So, most of the talks today are concerned especially with this problem of the different ways in which science or scientists are rendering race as something biological, or more specifically genetic, something you can sort of find and identify in the genome. My talk today is a slightly different angle of approach, where there is a very important legitimate concern with sort of this biologization of race. I'm really going to be talking about a phenomenon that I see as the biologization of racism. Recent work that is really about trying to identify a biological basis for racism, locating it in specific portions of the brain as a basis for addressing problems of discrimination in society. And so I'm going to sort of take us through that and some of the promise of some of the research in this area, but also some of my concerns with it. The implicit association test is something some of you may be familiar with, and it's a test that's meant to measure sort of what people call unconscious bias. And the way it does this is it's sort of the way it's described, and I'll just read this description to you, is it measures attitudes and beliefs that people may be unwilling or unable to report. The IAT, the implicit association test, may be especially interesting if it shows that you have an implicit attitude you did not know about. For example, you may believe that men and women should be equally associated with science, but your automatic associations could show that you, like many others, associate men with science more than you associate women with science. So, right, we have all sorts of implicit associations, biases, mind bugs, heuristics, these are different terms that are used, that sort of shape the way we view the world, but it's beyond our conscious perception or control. Okay, so what the IAT measures, it measures basically the strength of associations you have between concepts, like black people, gay people, and evaluations, like good or bad, or stereotypes, like up there, athletic, clumsy, and so forth. And the main idea is that making a response is easier when closely related items share our same response key on a computer on which you're taking the test. So the way this works, and you can actually, there's something called, a website called Project Implicit, located at Harvard, where you can do this over the web. Literally millions of people have done this test over the web. And so how does it actually work? Well, when you're taking an IAT, you're sitting at your little computer, there's the E key and the I key, I've got them right here. And what you do first is you sort a series of categories, words on the left and right-hand side of the computer. And for instance, categories on the left-hand side of the computer that you're sorting might be something like fat people and good, sort of like, you know, things associated with those. And on the left would be thin people, bad. You know, like bad would be, I don't know, tarantula, and good would be, you know, violet or, you know, rose or something. And then you flip, and you see how fast you can make these associations. And this is sort of how a pen and pencil version of it looks, where you have, you can see up here, you've got female or career here, male or family there, and you're presented with these words, and it's like, how quickly can you say that, oh yes, she goes with female, right? But garden, right, does garden go with female or does it go with male and family? Because you might associate garden with family more than you would with career, and sort of how quickly you can make these associations tell sort of what your implicit biases are. This is how it might look on a computer screen. the race IAT, where again, you're supposed to sort, you're presented with a picture, and you say, okay, is that picture African American or good, or is it European American or bad? And you see it, like, how fast can you click the key to make that sort? And then you do that, and then you would flip it, where you'd associate African American and bad things, and Europeans and good things. And so the idea is, when you analyze the results, basically you would say that we have a person has an implicit preference for, say, thin people relative to fat people if they are able to categorize thin people, words when thin people and good share a response key, right? Then, and fat people and bad share a response key, right? So, it's just, it's down to literally to the millisecond how fast they measure this. And so what does it find? Well, it finds lots of implicit bias. To a certain degree, I read this and I say, yeah, of course. I mean, it doesn't seem that surprising. But it really actually shatters a lot of people who take this test. They think, I'm not, especially things like the race IAT. It's like, I'm not racist, right? Nobody's racist. Nobody thinks they're racist. Cliven Bundy doesn't think he's racist, right? But, but there's this surprise, right? And so they find lots and lots of implicit bias. What's interesting is a lot of the researchers in this area are very reluctant to call it racism. They'll call it bias, implicit bias, but they don't want to call it racism. There's a whole lot of there that can be sort of unpacked in its own right. And maybe I'll come back to that later. But there are some psychologists who call it aversive racism, which is the idea that sort of just kind of uneasiness around people of a different race, or white people feeling uneasy around black people, sort of averting eyes and things like that. And that's how the aversive. It's not like overt, good old, let's go lynch 'em racism. It's like, oh, I don't want to look you in the eye racism, right? So one of my concerns is what's happened in the last decade or so when work in this area of implicit bias, which began in the late 1990s and has gained a lot of traction in certain parts of both the world of psychology, but especially in the legal academy, which is sort of where I live, has been combined with work in neuroscience, and where they put people in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine while they're taking the IAT. And so literally, this is your brain on the IAT, and the idea is the little green area, the fusiform gyrus, is, well, oh yes, that lights up when you identify a racially salient marker, and then your amygdala lights up when it sort of gives a valence to it, a positive or negative valence, because the amygdala is where sort of emotional salience is processed. I mean, this is all, people keep sort of, changing what these really mean. But so the amygdala lights up, and then the anterior cingulate cortex lights up because, it's monitoring the fact that you have just seen somebody who's making you afraid. And then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex kicks in to try to regulate that response, because you don't want to think you're racist, and you don't want anybody else to think you're racist, so you suppress your amygdala, right? And this is all happening in the blink of an eye. But so they're identifying this in the fMRI. So there are articles that, that use words like neural correlates of race. So it's like they're locating, these little dots where your brain lights up when you see race. And so this is sort of, race on the brain, right? This is race in your brain, right? So one of the big concerns about all this is, well, how does it manifest itself socially? What are the real impact of this? Why should we be concerned? Well, there is the general behavior, the aversive stuff I talked about. There have been various sort of psychology experiments saying, oh yes, people avert their eyes, they don't sit as close to somebody of another race, that kind of thing. There are also very practical implications for healthcare encounters, observing doctors who are much less likely to prescribe equivalent levels of pain medication to black people than to white people, but they're not consciously aware of it. They give different diagnoses based on, again, stereotypes that they're not necessarily that consciously aware of. Similar things in an employment setting, people saying, oh, the person just didn't sort of give me the right vibe, it had nothing to do with their race, I just, that kind of thing. And it sort of goes down, its implications very much for judicial proceedings, assessments of guilt, or even just credibility. various studies showing that sort of these mock trials showing, these experiments showing that even within sort of people classified as African American or white, that the greater the degree of stereotypically Afrocentric features a face has, the greater the sentence that a sort of mock jury would give for the same offense, right? So there are some very strong correlations here. It's a real issue. It's significant, and deserves consideration. Oh, and the last thing is law enforcement. There's this thing called shooter tests, where law enforcement officers are much more ready to identify, to make mistakes, right? Identifying if a suspect is black, they will much more likely mistake like a wallet for a gun than they will if the suspect is white. And given what's been happening in Ferguson and everywhere, this is important stuff. So legal and policy implications for this, again, wide-ranging implications for questions of employment discrimination, making a case in employment discrimination under what's known as disparate impact doctrine, disparate treatment doctrine, the idea of needing to prove a violation of equal protection law based on the subjective intent of somebody discriminating against you. You can say, oh, it's no longer a matter of explicit racism, it's implicit racism that's motivating them. Similarly, in affirmative action, people are talking about using affirmative action isn't just about promoting diversity, it's about the diversity makes people lessen their implicit bias, right? It de-biases them, encountering with people from diverse groups. And again, just going down the list, fair trial, the idea is that you want to make racial accommodations and remedies to try to address these stereotypes. Again, all very, very laudable in many respects. There are some existing critiques out there of particularly the implicit association test and the theory underlying it known as implicit social cognition. From the right, there are challenges, particularly from Tetlock and Mitchell are just sort of representative scholars here, challenging sort of the meaning and significance of these experiments, particularly the IATs, arguing that it really just shows that people are sort of have adopted the stereotypes of their society, but don't necessarily feel, it's reflecting their understanding of the way society views this whatever the group is, whether, black, thin, gay, whatever. It's not really their personal implicit prejudice. From the center, I say center, just sort of, there are technical challenges to all of this. Arguing, for instance, that it's very difficult to make generalized conclusions or assertions from findings that generally have been established in very controlled laboratory settings, both in both a lot of the psychological experiments and particularly, fMRI. It's not like you can take an fMRI out into the field and, hook people into it and see what's happening out in the real world. There's also what I call their weird issues, which is in the field of neuroscience. This is specific to the fMRI studies. Is almost all of these studies, locating racism on the brain, are conducted in very small cohorts of weird people, Western, highly educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries, right? Right. So, and this is one of the problems with, it's like how representative are these samples? There are a host of other sort of technical issues, but I'm neither really qualified or desirous of getting into those. And then from the left, there's some concerns, because most of the people urging the use of implicit bias are, they're very liberal, racial justice kinds of folks. But there are people from the left, I include myself among them, who have some real concerns about the broader implications of this. Among those, Banks and Ford law professors up at Stanford, William Wellman, sociologist at Santa Cruz, raise concerns about the focus on the individual that is so central to implicit bias theory, that's sort of ignoring or marginalizing issues of structural racism and power relations. And that's related to the kinds of critique that I want to sort of expand upon now in the rest of my talk. So I'm particularly concerned about kind of the unintended consequences of this other, I think, clearly well-meaning approach to dealing with racism in current society. And what I see is sort of, as I say, the unintended consequences of this. One is, I find in a lot of this scholarship and a lot of the policies, and it's not just scholarship and policies, there are elaborate programs out there that are training judges in several states, that there's a whole business in sort of diversity training going into corporations everywhere. It's a huge, huge area of direct intervention. So the first is, particularly in the legal context, is accepting a conservative frame for understanding contemporary basis of the legal status of race and racism under equal protection law. Something I call deracinating the legal subject. I'll come back to each of these. Sort of stripping the identity of legal subjects in society. Obscuring power relations, seeking a technical fix to very complex and messy social problems, and part of that subordinating democracy, democratic interventions to sort of expert technocratic interventions. And then finally, what I opened with, this issue of biologizing racism. So for the remainder of my talk, if I can go through and briefly elaborate on some of these concerns. First, the idea of accepting the conservative frame. Particularly, a lot of the work in this area accepts the conservative legal framework of cases like Bakke and Washington versus Davis, which, again, I won't go into all the arcane legal doctrine involved here, but in part what they involve is a very strong focus on individual attitudes as a basis for trying to establish a claim of discrimination under the law, needing to look at intent versus sort of the overall impact of the law. And the idea here is that racism can be rendered a function of quantifiable metrics based on an individual's sort of response to an implicit association test. So it buys into the idea that you've got to prove individual intent to discriminate in order to make a case, rather than look at the overall structure of a situation and look at the disparities that are evident in employment contexts or so forth. There's also, it embraces the diversity rationale that it was at the core of the Bakke case, the affirmative action case that says, well, we will let affirmative action go forward because it promotes diversity. And diversity is the only interest the state has that is compelling enough to justify the use of race in admission or hiring practices. They're promoting diversity. And diversity is all well and good, but it's actually a very thin rationale for supporting redress of historical racial injustice. In particular, what diversity does, where I say that race is just one of many factors, what diversity says is essentially, well, you can take race into account just like you take anything else into account, right? Like geographic diversity, or economic diversity, or speaking French or Italian. It's just one more thing. There's nothing distinctive or special about our history of racial discrimination. It's just one more thing. And then the idea that structure is relevant, but relevant primarily as a shaper of individual attitudes, not, again, as anything that embeds or allocates power or goods in society. Racism itself is really rendered simply a function of personal attitudes translated into behavior, which certainly that's an aspect of it, but it really makes it the overarching frame. Okay. In particular, it embraces this idea of colorblindness, which is at the heart of sort of conservative backlash against affirmative action. And so I have this, the ideal of a colorblind amygdala, which is sort of, again, what really lights up most on the fMRI, is the idea that what they really want to do in training people to reduce their implicit bias is the idea is, well, everybody's amygdala your amygdala should respond the same to everybody, right, regardless of their race, right? It should just be colorblind, which is clearly echoing the jurisprudence of people like Scalia, Roberts, and O'Connor, who keep talking about getting past race, right? Transcending race, either temporally or spatially, just leave it behind, right? We can move above and beyond race, and we should be blind to it. And that's where, again, this is just a reference to a quote of Scalia, if there, again, for the law people in the audience, that there are no debtor or creditor amygdalas. He had this thing about how with affirmative action there are no debtor or creditor races. And that, again, a way of erasing the past. And it's like, well, your amygdala shouldn't feel guilty about anything, right? And that's what relates to this idea of deracinating the legal subject. You're stripping the identity away. We shouldn't have identity, right? The unencumbered brain. Your brain should not be burdened with the historical legacy of racism in the United States. It should be free from all that. It should be rendered blind to that. And this is related to the idea that actually Banks and Ford talk about a bit of a kind of uncritical embrace of this ideal of an objective meritocracy. The idea that the only thing we should evaluate people for, especially say in an employment context, is the again, objective ability to perform a functional task, sort of reducing somebody to a pure functionality, technocratic functionality, and that nothing else should play a role in the evaluation of an individual. And maybe sometimes that's the case, but maybe sometimes identity makes a difference, and that's okay. Of course, it's very dangerous and tricky to take identity into consideration, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. There's also this question that legal scholar Martha Minow talks about, the dilemma of difference, which is the idea that, essentially, sometimes, seeing difference can stigmatize somebody, right? But sometimes ignoring difference can also stigmatize somebody, right? If you're not seeing their distinctive identity, that can also be harmful. And the whole approach of the IAT sort of obscures that consideration. And in particular, in this regard, there's a problem, this is almost a technical problem with the IAT, which is a problem of intersectionality, which is this idea that, the IAT is structured as sort of a 2-by-2 situation, black, white, good, bad, right? It can't take into account multiple variable aspects of our identity, right? It can't take into account black, gay, fat, disabled, good or bad, right, and so forth, or female, Latina, short, and I don't know, red-haired, something, right? It can only do it in a binary way, so it's also very reductive that way. The approach of IAT also obscures power relations, particularly in the way it tries to remedy implicit bias, which is largely through, I talk about submerged anti-racism here, which is actually an idea I take from the political scientist Suzanne Mettler, who talks about the submerged state in a recent book, which is about how liberal policies to try to improve social conditions are all indirect and submerged. In the last 2 decades, instead of passing, a big thing like, Medicare or the Environmental Protection Act or something, which was passed under Nixon, but still, we do things through tax credits, right? Or through mortgage tax deduction, or for, credits for this, which is all invisible. People don't know, right, all the benefits that they are getting from the federal government. It's all submerged, it's all obscured, sort of a technocratic way of managing people's preferences. And that's similar to what's happening in a lot of the approaches to implicit association and implicit bias. It casts racism as pervasive but invisible, right? Nobody can see it. But similarly, the responses are invisible. They are subliminal nudges, and that is my reference in particular to Cass Sunstein, late of the Obama administration's Office of Information Policy, and now a law professor right now back at Harvard, used to be Chicago, who had a book come out with behavioral economist Richard Thaler called Nudge. And it's about trying to shape informational environments in a way that help you make better decisions, which again, in the abstract, makes lots of good sense. It's the idea like, oh, well, for your retirement account, it should be opt-out instead of opt-in, right? So in other words, the default is that 10% of your paycheck goes to your 401k. Whether if you do nothing, it just goes, right? So it's a way of helping you save without you thinking about it. And the idea is, we do similar things to manipulate an informational environment, like, oh, we put screensavers of Bill Cosby and Martin Luther King on your computer, so you have positive images, right, of black people that are countering your implicit biases. And so it's all indirect, and it's all in some ways quite manipulative. There's also a certain narcissism about the implicit association test, right? It's all about me and my attitudes, and it's almost like I think of Barbara Ehrenreich's book Brightside. It's like, let's work on ourselves. The power of positive thinking, sort of like the power of positive subliminal nudging, right? Let's make me better. Let's make me a better person. Not the fact that, oh, I have benefited from the subjugation of an entire race for centuries. Let's not worry about that. Let's look at me, right? It makes me feel good, right? I'm taking the implicit. It's also what I call sort of recreational anti-racism, which is, I can take the IAT and see that I am biased. Isn't it good I did that, right? And but what the hell does it really cost me to do that, right? And so this is another concern. And then this idea of a thin proceduralism, which is essentially, right, it would be possible for everybody in the country to pass the IAT without changing the substantive allocation of goods or power one bit, right? You can make everybody feel better about it, but it's a very thin procedural approach. And there's actually has been suggested that one of the measures of when affirmative action programs could end would be when everybody passes the IAT. That would be a good objective way, right? So what this also involves is a concern for distrusting the citizen, which I've already sort of talked about, the idea of nudges versus engagement, right? And in particular, think about challenging, contrast the idea of nudging people through subliminal messages or shaping their informational environment, versus the March on Washington, right? Versus engaging citizens in political action or even just civic action. And for this, this is sort of a kind of a cutesy term, but there actually are, in the implicit association literature, they actually talk about unconsciousness raising as opposed to consciousness raising. And consciousness raising really much coming out of second wave feminism of the 60s and 70s. And it's worth thinking about what's involved in unconsciousness raising versus consciousness raising. Consciousness raising is essentially training given monologically by an expert in a centralized way to, in a centralized apolitical way to sort of like tell you this is how you overcome your implicit bias, as opposed to consciousness raising, which is decentralized, democratic, dialogic, and expressly political, right? And about power, right? So then related to this is the final, this question of underlying all this is seeking a technical fix to the messiness and sordidness of racism, right? And there are scholars, leading scholars in this area saying essentially like when the law and science of implicit bias diverge, law should follow the science. Law should be made to comport with the science. In other words, science leads the law here. There is this incredible discomfort with uncertainty and actual interpretive judgment, especially on the part of judges and juries, which is also part of the kind of distrusting of the citizen. There's a great distrust of discretion, and discretion too is a dangerous thing, right? The criminal justice system is rife with abuse of discretion, and I don't mean to minimize that, but the idea that it can be overcome through technical expert management is, and this sort of, I call it metric philia, you love anything you can measure, is highly problematic. And I just mentioned contrast with Charles Black on Brown. He was a wonderful law professor at Yale, passed away a while ago, but a constitutional law professor. As an undergraduate, I actually stage managed him in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, but that's a whole separate story. But which was essentially hearkening back to Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, which is essentially like, how do you, and it sort of echoes, I guess, who was a Justice Powell on pornography. It's like, racism, I know it when I see it, right? This is an argument about, making an argument about the common sense of racism in society. Race and racism as we're, who gets to determine that, right? Is it this, again, experts measuring it, or is it an interpretive act that we are doing communally, civically, to say, this is what we know is true, and this is what we're willing to sort of argue about as being true? Or do we simply turn it over to a function of measurement? And, Black in Brown, when he's talking about the Brown case, this was in article he wrote in 1960, where it was being argued saying, oh, well, Brown wasn't decided on neutral principles and this kind of thing. He said, look, We know what was going on in Brown. It was about white supremacy. It was about subjugating black people. We know that. To argue anything else is laughable, right? And that's essentially what Justice Harlan was saying back in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, right? So in the alternative realm, this idea that under the technical approach, in contrast to that, you have racism being identified, defined, and remedied via expert, technologically mediated interventions like the fMRI or the IAT or whatever other acronym you want to come up with, right? So finally, it leads to this last thing. This is my last slide on biologizing racism, right? So what you have with the IAT and the fMRI, when you put them together, what you get is a very powerful biological frame for conceptualizing, identifying, addressing something you're calling racism, right? So again, you're biologizing racism itself. It's something active in the brain. And racism then, as it becomes a function of biological measurement, it becomes susceptible to biological intervention. And that's where you have a host of articles exploring the impact of chemical compounds like oxytocin or the beta blocker propranolol on racist attitudes, right? And there was an article in particular that came out a couple of years ago now about saying, it said, oh, you know, take propranolol, a beta blocker that lots of people take, widely prescribed beta blocker, and if you take the IAT on propranolol, it mitigates, it reduces, it almost eliminates, right, your IAT bias. And you also take it before you go and play music, right? It calms the nerves, right? And so this is like this pharmaceutical intervention to address racism, which is part of a broader movement that people, like there's a bioethicist at Oxford named Julian Savulescu who talks about moral bioenhancement, and this is part of that. Right, he's one of the co-authors on the propranolol piece. The idea that we can enhance ourselves pharmaceutically to address something like racism. So, you know, that's the furthest branch of this sort of technical fix. Okay, I went 55 seconds over. I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you.